Hello, everyone, and welcome to a discussion with Rank the Vote and 100% Democracy. My name is Celia Nolan. I am the Training and Events Director with Rank the Vote. We are a national nonpartisan organization supporting the grassroots for ranked choice voting. And also, we are welcoming a lot of other democratic reforms that would promote our mission. So I'm very pleased this evening to be able to let you know about an organization in the democracy space. We welcome big ideas. We have to have ideas and decide what's going to be best for us. And 100% Democracy is definitely an organization that is in that vein. So as people are coming in here, we'll try to keep up with letting everyone in. If you could find your way to the chat and put what state you're in, be interesting to see where everyone is coming from. And if you have any questions for our friends at 100% Democracy at any point, you can put that in the chat. And we also have a spreadsheet. If you'd prefer to put it in the spreadsheet, you can put your question in without your name. If you'd prefer to submit it anonymously, I just put the link in the chat there. And also, if you want to chat me directly, I can also call out your question when we get to the discussion section if you would prefer to do it that way. And my goodness, people are streaming in from all over as I see it. Thanks so much for joining. This is such an interesting topic. We're going to talk about universal civic voting with 100% democracy. And we have two illustrious people with us here today from 100% Democracy. We have Miles Rapoport, who's the executive director and experience as a former elected official, state representative, and Connecticut Secretary of State, also president of Common Cause and author. I'm sure we'll be getting into that a little bit later. And also Raaheela Ahmed, who is the National Legislative and Organizing Director with 100% Democracy, also former elected on the County Board of Education and manager of leadership programs at New American Leaders before coming to 100% Democracy. And both of these folks have done very much besides. So I'm excited to hear about the work you do, about how it fits in our democracy space, and to see what kind of discussion we can get going. So I will hand it over to you, Miles and Raaheela.
Okay, Celia, first of all, let me say a big thank you to you for inviting us and to Rank the Vote for inviting us and to kind of stimulate this cross-issue conversation. I really, really appreciate it. And thanks to everybody who has come on to the event. Let me start actually by saying that I want to give an homage to the work that has happened on ranked choice voting over the years. I took a look at the website at your website and discovered that there were kind of three um, arguments that you made for why ranked choice voting was really, really important. And I thought I was struck by how similar they are to what we say about universal voting, which I'll come back and describe. But you talk about gridlock and the way in which government is not responsive to many, many people's needs, and that contributes to the lack of trust in government. You talk about polarization, and we also think that 100% democracy and universal voting is an antidote, not complete, but a partial antidote to the kind of polarization we see. And then thirdly, you talk about negativity. And that's also something that really concerns us and we think that universal voting and the need for people to appeal to everyone under universal voting uh, cuts down the incentive. It changes the incentive structure and cuts down on universal voting. So anyway, with that said, so I really and the second homage actually is I see us as about 25 years behind the ranked choice voting movement, but a little bit on the same trajectory, which is to take a reform that is not on the radar screen, having to elevate it inject it first, and then elevate it in the public debate, get it out there, make it part of the democracy movement, and try to get it passed in some places. And I know that that really has been the trajectory of the ranked choice voting movement, as far as I understand it. And it's taken a while, but it went from some municipalities to counties to now in several states, and being one of the things that people are seriously talking about. So I think that's great. I think that's a great um, progression, and it's certainly something that we are hoping to do with universal voting. So let me start, and we can start the slideshow, I guess, by saying in a way, introducing myself a little bit by saying that I have been involved in the democracy movement for over 40 years. I started out as an organizer, but I was state legislator in Connecticut for 10 years. I see someone here from Connecticut. Hello. Um, and then I served as Secretary of the State in Connecticut in the 90s. And then I was president of Demos for 13 years and president of Common Cause for three, and have been spent 5 years at the Kennedy School working as a senior practice fellow in democracy. So what I learned, one of the things that I have learned in all that time is that there are a tremendous number of reforms that are needed in our democracy. And we have a whole multiplicity of problems. And I'm very loath to say that, well, if you just do this, it'll solve all our problems. I mean, there are issues about money in politics. There are issues about political parties and the duopoly. There are issues about turnout. There are issues about the Electoral College. There are issues about the undemocratic nature of the United States Senate. So we have a broad set of issues that we have to deal with. But in 100% democracy, we have chosen to say the issue of participation and getting full participation is really, really important. So let's go to the next slide. And I'm going to take the first 7 or 8 slides, and then Raaheela Ahmed, who you see, who is my colleague, fabulous colleague, I'll say, and the National Legislative and Organizing Director, will take over from there. But after all the years of trying to move and expand voting and elections, I said to myself, many people have said it, but so we've done all of these things in terms of in the lane of expanding voting and participation. We have same-day voter registration. We have the restoration of voting rights for people with felony convictions. We have automatic voter registration. We have early voting. We have online registration. We have automatic registration. We've just done a number of things. I mean, enough that there's been huge pushback. But when you really seriously look at it, we've moved the needle a little bit, but not nearly enough. And if you believe, as I do, that we want elections where everyone is participating, then you got to say to yourself, and I said to myself, is there something that could really move the needle in a serious way, right? The American turnout is pitiful if you look at it in an international context. 2020 was the record turnout in a presidential election, and it was at 66%. 2018 was the record turnout in a midterm election, and it was just a hair over 50%. And in 2024, we went down from the 66% to 63.88%, which means that over a third, of the voting eligible population was not heard, their voice was not heard, and their ideas were not counted in this election. So, sort of said, what is it that could really move the needle? Let's go to the next slide. So I discovered that there are 25 countries around the world, we'll see the map in a minute, where voting is a required civic duty. Basically, some places call it compulsory voting, some places call it mandatory voting. We call it universal voting because the issue is really to say that participation in the election, not a vote for or against a candidate, is a fundamental and a required civic duty. And we believe that this is the only reform in the lane of participation that can move the needle dramatically and has proven that it has done so. All right, so next slide. It's also, we've discovered, not at all a radical idea. Universal voting is used currently in 25 democratic countries around the world. As you can see in the map, it's not almost all, but the majority of Latin American countries use it. including Mexico. Belgium was the first country to enact universal voting in 1893. Their voting, universal voting places in every continent. But the example that we use mostly as we talk about it is Australia. Australia enacted universal voting in 1924. So, as my colleague and co-author E.J. Dionne likes to say, universal voting is a brand new idea with 100 years of proof of concept. So, what has happened? Let's take a quick look at Australia as our example. Although there are different ways to do it, all different countries have different ways of implementing universal voting. Greece, which is one of the countries, you are required to vote, but there's no penalty or no enforcement whatsoever. And it's still just a statement that it is a civic duty, um, uh, raises the turnout. Next slide, please. So in Australia, as I started to say, it was adopted in 1924. Election day is always on a Saturday in Australia. They have a very strong central national Australian Electoral Commission, which does a huge amount of work to get people enrolled, to get people to know about the election, how to do it, etc. They have all of the reforms that we have been talking about. They have early voting, vote by mail. They have a lot of mobile votings, the big territory, and you can vote at any polling place in the state because it's electronic. You don't have to vote for one candidate or another. You can unmark ballots. They call them donkey ballots there. And they have a very, it's resulted over 100 years in a very celebratory civic culture. One of the traditions, this is actually funny, I really like this one, is a tradition called democracy sausages. And what that is that nonprofit organizations go to the polling places, sell democracy sausages, very specific. It is a sausage in a folded over piece of white bread with fried onions on the top. And you can the fact that you can go and vote at any place means that people go to Yelp, find out where the best sausages are, and that's where they go vote. So it's quite something. But most importantly, they have had 90%, they had 60% turnout in the election before 1924. They had a 90% turnout immediately thereafter, and they have had a 90% turnout in every election for 100 years. And think what that would mean for the United States. Okay, next slide. So, how do they do it in Australia? As I said, it can happen in different places. And as we think about it in the United States, yes, we would very much like to do it with their experiment in different ways of implementation. But just taking Australia as a model, they have what we call light touch enforcement. So, 90% of the people vote. If you're one of the 10% of the people, then who didn't vote, they send you a letter afterwards and they say, gee, Miles Rapoport from Great Neck South, yes, that is me. How come you didn't vote today? And any reason you give is accepted. So I was visiting my grandmother in Perth. Fine. That's why you didn't vote. That's why you didn't vote. So most people will give some reason, and that's fine. If you don't respond at all, they send you a second letter and you same process. And if you don't respond at all to either of that, they send you a parking ticket or they send you a fine of 20 Australian dollars, which is 13 US dollars right now. Okay. So out of with all that process, a very, very small number of people actually are assessed the fine. And there's not real, and if you don't pay it, it's not like they charge interest and penalties and you go to court and all that stuff. It is what it is. But what's interesting is it's part of the culture. It's sort of like it's what you do. By the way, let me just make the obvious analogy, which is jury duty. If you say, well, gee, we don't have required civic duties here. Well, we do. Um, if you are required to serve on a jury if you get called. And of course, not everybody wants to go, but I've never heard anybody say to me, gee, how dare they make me serve on a jury? And the reason is that it's part of the culture. It's been that way for 100 years. I think voting and the logic of universal voting is the same way. Okay, next slide. So I'm going to pass it over to Raaheela now. We think there are a number of really key benefits of universal voting, and there are some issues that people raise about it. But Raaheela is far better at explaining this than I am, so I'll pass it over to
Well,
her.
thanks, Miles. And hi, everybody. It's so nice to be able to join you this evening to talk about universal voting. I'll start off here with a lot of what we have to gain from a system like universal voting, and I'll go through the benefits now. The first one is really just like in Australia, we can expect overall voter participation to drastically increase, leading to a much more reflective electorate.
Next slide.
Yeah, this is with the
Oh,
understanding that currently large stretches of marginalized communities are not voting at the same levels as their majority counterparts. In an analysis that we did in Connecticut last year, we found that under universal voting, 37% more people of color would be voting, and that the participation numbers of young voters aged 18 to 24 would more than double as compared to 2020 election numbers. So those are pretty game-changing figures that would really help us get to a place of being a truly self-governing society. The second point here is that it stands to reason that under universal voting, we'll have less polarization. I believe, like many others, that inflammatory partisan rhetoric doesn't resonate with the average person, because if it did, we'd have seen many more people activated in previous elections. An important thing to note is that in 2016, the largest vote getter was neither political party frontrunner. It was actually no one, because over 40% of eligible voters didn't come out to vote. So if we're not focused on using language and posturing to repress a base or to turn out a base, campaigns and candidates will communicate and behave differently. And I imagine part of that means being focused on the actual issues that people care about. The third point here is that under universal voting, we envision that we'd have a more accountable political system that better responds to the need of underrepresented communities. And the way that I see this is that we are so often caught up on the process of democracy, right? Who can vote and who can't vote, that the on the ground community issues don't receive all of the money, the resources, and the attention that they should. But under UV, universal voting, we can focus more on those important issues and having them actually addressed by our elected officials. Okay, this is where I vocalize y'all's innermost hesitations or wonderings about universal voting, like, is universal voting constitutional? We say yes. Our proposal is really for mandatory participation in elections, not mandatory voting. And the rationale is no requirement to vote for or against a candidate or measure means no compelled speech, and that there's no constitutional prohibition to that. The second point here is essentially some people will argue against all but the barest minimum of government compulsion, but our government mandates many different civic responsibilities to make sure that we have a functioning society. And that includes paying taxes, educating our children, vehicle safety, emissions and inspections, and many other things like that. But probably the best analogy, which Miles has already mentioned, is with jury duty, where people across the racial and socioeconomic spectrum are compelled equally to participate in our legal system and the effort to make it better than it was before. The third item here, the ignorant voters argument, this is basically, some folks make the argument that you're now going to push people to the polls that are not interested and have no idea who or what they're voting for, and that would lead to bad results. And really at its core, that's a pretty undemocratic way to think, because you're essentially saying that the opinion of some people carry more weight than others. And it stands to reason that if people knew that they had to participate in voting, they would do their research and they would look into things more thoroughly, or that candidates and our governmental institutions would look into empowering the vote by sharing more information with everyone. And then the last point here is the unfair burden argument, or rather, it's the effect of fines on marginalized communities. And this is a really real concern, but it lies on local and state governing bodies to see what enforcement of universal voting would look like for their jurisdictions, whether that's a penalty, an incentive, or no enforcement whatsoever. If penalties are included and properly designed, like light enforcement, small fines, no interest or penalties, similar to what Miles was talking about in Australia, the actual cost would be small. And we believe, like with jury duty, that the benefits of significantly increased empowerment through universal participation would outweigh some of those potential costs. But again, it lies on people and jurisdictions to decide what enforcement looks like or non-enforcement, if that's an option. On the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about laying the groundwork. Really, it doesn't make sense to enact universal voting on a voter repressive system. So we have listed on this slide what we believe to be key gateway reforms that pave the way for successful implementation of universal voting. You could definitely still do it if you don't have a few of these, but if most of them are not here, then it would be extremely challenging to enact this type of a system. So if you're looking at this list and you're saying, hey, I think we're in pretty good shape, maybe we can do something here. Let me tell you a little bit about what governments can do. And if you're looking at it from like a cities and municipalities perspective, you may want to advocate for enabling legislation from your state for local jurisdictions to be able to do this. Maybe introduce local legislation for city elections or advocate for passage of state legislation. Those are a couple things that can happen on the city and municipal level. On the state level, introducing state legislation for general elections involving universal voting is an option, or passing enabling legislation to allow municipalities to do this is another option. On the next slide, I've listed a couple of these states where we've had some legislation moving in past years. So in Washington State, we had a Senate bill that was introduced with 14 Senate co-sponsors, including the Senate president, that passed out of committee. And a companion bill was filed in the House in the previous couple of years. In Connecticut, there were 2 bills, universal voting bills, that were filed in 2023, each with multiple co-sponsors, and both bills received a subject matter hearing by the Government Administration and Elections Committee, but didn't go much further than that. In Utah, there was an introduction of a bill, a House bill, that would have allowed municipalities to enact universal voting. Not much traction there either. But this year, we have had some bills moving. In Illinois, there are 2 bills that are moving, one in the Senate and one in the House, and they're advocating for a line in the law that says that all eligible citizens should cast a ballot in every general election, and that includes blank ballots. And in Connecticut, we have 3 universal voting bills that were filed, 2 in the House and 1 in the Senate, with multiple co-sponsors on some of them. And 2 of them are advocating for task force and commissions on 100% voting participation. And 1 is asking for straight up civic duty voting requirement. So hearings for those bills, we're waiting on those to come through. But it's important to note that none of the bills for this year are advocating for any penalties or punitive enforcement measures for non-compliance. They're really aspirational in nature and focus on committing their states to getting everyone out to vote, and committing their states to 100% voting participation. I have one more slide. Before I give it over to Miles, I want to talk a little bit about data. This is a pictorial of the data I referenced earlier from Connecticut. Essentially, we solicited the support of scholars from the Harvard Kennedy School to do an analysis of what 90% voter turnout would look like if implemented in the state of Connecticut. And these are the findings that you see here, namely that 2.1 million more people would turn out to vote under universal voting, increasing the statewide turnout by 18.5%. And then it shows that in aggregate, nearly 110,000 more voters of color would participate in elections from the 2020 general election. And lastly, I think another key figure here is that the amount of young voters would more than double, a 40% increase, or 65,000 voters. This is pretty game-changing in terms of policy development, legislative representation, and more. On this slide, you'll also see a QR code that you can scan to read the full report. So folks are more than welcome to do that at this point as well. With that, Miles, I'll pass it over to you to talk a little bit about strategy.
Okay. All right. So I just want to, this is in a way a repeat of something I already said, but again, I really feel like there's a parallel here between the work that all of you are doing on ranked choice voting and the work that we are doing on universal voting. And I think the two reforms are quite synergistic. So I really appreciate it. And I was around when all this started. I was at Demos when ranked choice voting was first introduced, sometimes called instant runoff voting. And then I just watched as it moved from the kind of as a fringe idea into the real mainstream of public debate. And we have what a 3-point strategy, which is essentially what you have used over the years. And the 3 points are: one, to elevate the idea of universal voting in the public debate, to just have people know about it, understand that it is not a radical idea, that Americans can learn something from elsewhere. And we think that's beginning to happen. Secondly, that we want to get organizations to endorse universal voting, not in place of the work that they're doing, but as a part of an agenda. And there are 6 national organizations that have endorsed universal voting. Um, and then the third part of our strategy is to try to find places where we can move it legislatively, either in municipalities or in states. I mean, you could have federal legislation, you could have federal ranked choice voting, but I think in both of our cases, um, the focus has got to be for the foreseeable future will be on the state and local. So anyway, I'm a fan of the issue of giving voters more choices, and I'm a fan of the work and all of the work, an admirer of all the work that's been done. Next slide, and then I'll wrap it up. So this is a different way of saying the 3 strategy points that I made: educate everybody, connect with organizations, and then advocate, which is a 501(c)(3) word for moving legislation. So that's what we're trying to do. Um, we are eager to spread the word. We'd be delighted to have be able to speak or to engage with your organizations on a local level if you'd like us to. And at that point, I put our website in the chat, and hopefully people will go. You can sign up, get on our newsletter. This is all stuff you do by heart anyway. Um, and let's go from there. But anyway, Raaheela and I are happy, Celia, to pass it back to you and have you moderate any questions. I didn't say anything about the book. What kind of self-promoter am I if I didn't even say anything about the book? So in 2022, I co-wrote a book with E.J. Dionne, the Washington Post columnist, and the forward was by Heather McGhee, who many of you probably know. 100% Democracy, the Case for Universal Voting, in which we laid out basically all of this. Um, and then the book then morphed into the organization 100% Democracy, which and Raaheela and I are the 2 key staff people of it. But I encourage you to go to Amazon, or no, don't go to Amazon. Go somewhere else and buy the book. Um, and or if you really, really want, if you send me an email, and my email is miles.rapoport at 100% PERCENT democracy. Raaheela, why don't you put my email in it? I actually have some books, and if you promise you'll read it, I will send you a copy. Okay, Celia, back to you.
Well, thanks so much. There's so much to let sink in and think about. I'm very excited to see the questions come in. And I will say, Miles, I'm a little ahead of the game. I did read the book and really
Okay.
enjoyed it. So I encourage it. It's not intimidating. You do not have to be a political scientist or a wonk. It's written to be very understandable and lay out the case. Um, and I will also say, you're speaking to mainly ranked choice voting advocates. There was a slide and a mention of RCV that was not just for our meeting today. There is that information in the book also. And absolutely, that's the approach you describe is very familiar to us, I'm sure. So let's see. I'm going to take a look at the questions we're having coming in and keep putting them in the chat here. We have a question from Tracy in Georgia. Would this apply only to general elections?
I'll answer that. Basically, the answer is yes. Um, we think it's, there are some places clearly where primaries are in effect the general election. But I think it gets really complicated if you start to say people are required to vote in a primary that is run by or affects one single party. So yes, our recommendations are that this should be done in general elections. And by the way, one of the things that is true in Australia and many other countries where they have universal voting, is that elections are consolidated. I mean, one of the things about the United States is we have a myriad of elections. And that makes it a little more complicated. So if you kind of, if I would, it's not our position, but I would be an advocate for consolidating elections so that more of the elections fall in the same time in the same year. But anyway, yes, this we are talking about doing this for general elections.
And as a corollary, how would that happen? What's required to implement it? Would this be federal law, state law? Can you dig into that?
Sure. Rahila, you want to answer that?
So really, we're operating on two different levels here, cities and states. So city elections, whatever is allowable by the city to be able to, some cities can do election changes and others cannot. It just depends on home rule and charter authority. And so there are some towns that can do it for towns can do it, cities can do it for city elections in that way. And on the state level, um, states can do it for elections that involve the state. And that sometimes corresponds with federal elections too. If you're thinking of Congress is every 2 years, that kind of thing.
Yeah, the states are clearly in the Constitution enabled to, do the time, place, and manner of elections. And so we are looking at it state by state. You could do this at the federal level. One of the reasons that I like this, same thing for ranked choice voting. It doesn't require a constitutional amendment. It doesn't require federal legislation. This can definitely be done on the state by state basis. And John Fixell, I'm just looking at your question in the chat. If you notice that all the states that we are talking about trying to move universal voting in are states that have pretty good election policies. And you're right. If there are states where you have a kind of a voter suppressive system, and there are many, um, you know, generally places where the MAGA people have taken over, you really couldn't do universal voting. You can't say it's a requirement that you vote and then make it really hard for you to do so. So states like Washington, Maine, Maryland, Minnesota, Connecticut, Illinois have generally speaking, inviting and encouraging laws about voting. So those are the places that we're looking at first. You could,
If
it's
I,
actually a
if I,
very
if
interesting.
I, if I may pursue, um, in our state, and I think many, for instance, we're playing whack-a-mole with legislative bills to restrict voting,
Yeah.
restrict access. And I mean, it just flies in the face of what you're saying. I love what you're saying, and uh, I can see that it would be a solution to many issues, but how do we push back?
Yeah. No, we're at a very strange moment in history. Obviously, our hope was that after the November of 2024 elections, we would be in a moment of democratic imagination and innovation, um, where universal voting as well as ranked choice voting could be kind of a North Star reform in places where people are thinking about how to make things better. However, we are where we are. And so there's a tremendous amount of defense that's going to need to be played. Whack-a-mole is a good word for it, although actually it might be more like putting up the dike against the flood. But there's a lot of terrible things that are likely to happen, and we all have a responsibility to push back on them. But I kind of go back to the song, with, don't stop thinking about tomorrow. Remember that song? And that's how I feel about it, which is at the same time that we're pushing back against these violations of democratic norms and democratic principles, we also have to be saying, what is it that we really want our democracy to look like? And I, for one, want it to look like one where everyone, every single person is participating in the act of government, in the collective act of governance.
This leads into another question from John, actually. So, we talk about compulsory voting, universal voting required. What does that actually mean? How would it be required? What would the language be and enforcement?
So there are two things. Raaheela, you jump in, but I'll just say very quickly. We are now, the way we are presenting this is that our goal is 100% participation. And we're a little bit eclectic or agnostic about sort of how to get there. We're so far from there in states. So the bills that we're talking about in Connecticut, for instance, have three elements. One, that the state should resolve that our goal is to have 100% voting participation. Okay, that's a long-term goal. Two, that a study commission should be set up to figure out all the things that we could do in order to reach that goal. And that one of them to be studied is the experience of countries where they have universal or mandatory voting. And then third is that the state should allow municipalities or counties um, to do experiments that lead towards 100% towards universal voting. So that's this, it's obviously a kind of halfway step towards the idea of universal voting. And so the state might decide, well, we're going to give a $25 tax credit on your state income tax to people who have voted. Would I be opposed to that? No. I mean, we talk about the Australian model because it appears to be the most effective at really, really doing turnout. Which is basically if you have a law and you want people to obey it, there's got to be some enforcement. But we're very much open to different ways of doing this as a starting point, as long as we keep in mind, keep our eyes on the prize, so to speak, that what we want is 100% participation. So yeah, so there are very varying mechanisms, John, that we could use to try to get towards 100% voting, other than the Australia model, which is a small fine. Raaheela, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to note that I put in the chat box the actual bill numbers of what's moving in this year for folks that might that specific language that legislators have put forward on how they want to move and what they want to move. To the other point about incentives, I think incentives are, because I think I noticed that on as another question that was posed by somebody, that's not out of the question in some instances, but there is some type of issue when it comes to when federal elections are on the ballot, that could be perceived as being fallen under some type of bribery, right, or something like that. And so when it comes to certain elections, it could be difficult. It'll be more difficult and more of a legal challenge to try and pursue incentives. And on the local level, as long as there's not preemption by the state, there might be an opportunity for local incentives that isn't challenged as deeply, but that is really on a case-by-case basis to see what is possible in your specific jurisdiction.
Thank you. And I saw a hand up. Ed Shoemaker, if you still have a question, you can go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Hey, quick question. I'm not sure if this has ever come up. I'm a big fan of universal voting and voting in general. But what if a southern state wanted to weaponize this, against a low turnout demographic as sort of like a reverse poll tax? Is that possible? Would they be able to do that? Has that even been brought up? Yeah, that's my question.
First of all, you're not. I'd like to say, based on your background, that you're not allowed to offer people drinks in exchange for voting. Although I'll have one afterwards if you want to give me one. Anyway, yes, that has been brought up a lot, and it goes to the question of where are we trying to move this? We are trying to move it in places where it would really work. Could you imagine, call it Georgia, a state enacting this as a way of punishing poor people? You could imagine it, but I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think it's realistic. You know what I mean? It's hard to imagine Georgia enacting this. It would be so tongue in cheek, and so hypocritical that it's hard to imagine. We don't see any and we certainly don't see any motion toward it in those states. Those states are not going to do this.
I don't think they could get away with that in Georgia, but then you never know about Mississippi and Alabama. But thank you.
Thanks, Ed. And Steve, do you want to go ahead and unmute? You have a question?
Steve, you're still on mute, but also to answer your question in the chat, for some of the reasons that Miles indicated before, we don't have substantial movement in Florida. But you may have another question. We still can't hear you.
Okay, well, here, I guess I clicked the right button this time. Um, I'm on the executive committee of Rake My Vote Florida, and this is something that I think would be very interesting to us. And I wish there was a way that we could collaborate with you more and, perhaps make Florida a possible hot point for you. DeSantis is going to be out in a couple of years, and it's unclear who his successor is going to be, although his wife, oh my God, has thrown her hat in the pool, but we'll have to wait and see what the Democrats do. I mean, Florida used to be a purple state, and before that, I mean, it was a blue state, so who knows?
Right. Well, I will say this in response. We would love to begin to present the idea of universal voting to groups in Florida. So if you have any thoughts about, you know, um, inviting us presumably by Zoom to a gathering like tonight to talk about this, we'd love to do that as a small starting point of how we could begin the conversation. It's a big state, it's a tough state, but you know, I'm absolutely for making the case anywhere we can make it. So
That's
we'd love to do that.
that's great. Um, we do have a weekly or a monthly, excuse me, Zoom meeting with our membership, and I would be just myself speaking, but I think I'm speaking for the majority of our people, would be delighted to have you make a presentation.
Okay, well, you have my email address. Raaheela's is the same. Um, so let us know, and we'll if you build it, we will come.
I like that. I will. I have to talk to the rest of the people, and we're not having a um, statewide meeting this month because we're undergoing kind of a change in leadership and things. But next month we will be. So I'm going to present to the board that this is something that we should do.
All right, we could be
Okay,
building
glad to.
coalitions on the call. And I'll go to Elise in Washington, and then we got some great questions in the chat, Sue.
Yeah, I just want to say I appreciated this overview. I actually spent my majority of my high school years in Australia, which is part of what hooked me on the idea of ranked choice voting and also helps me see the potential of universal voting. And I do really appreciate the focus on what it would take to get to universal voting in terms of making voting accessible. When I started in elections professionally, I remember attending an overview from Lake Research Partners, who shared that some of the best messaging we have is talking about what it takes to get everyone voting and everyone's vote to count. And I'm curious, I'm sure you probably know the folks there. I'm curious if you've worked with them to integrate an idea of universal civic duty voting into that messaging that they've tested so much. Does it still resonate if we're saying a world where everyone votes and they see that as a civic duty? Does that continue to see the positive impacts that they have reported?
Two things. Yes, I actually know Celinda Lake very well.
I'm sure.
Have done some work with her over the years and love what the work that she does. So I think it's great. Um, so yeah, I like the idea of seeing if we can integrate, maybe even get her to do a question or two on universal voting in the course of her polling. By the way, Elise, so we were in 2023, there was a bill in the state of Washington. I don't know if you remember, Senator Sam Hunt was the sponsor. I actually went out to Olympia and testified. This was in January of 2023, and I was in the audience. I was there in person, but by Zoom we had the Speaker of the Parliament of New South Wales, Australia, and he was terrific. He basically said, I can't understand why anybody would not want to do this." So I think it's great. I do have a funny little thing to tell you, which is almost invariably, and Elise, you're an example of that tonight. Someone in an audience will get up and say, "I'm from Australia," or, "My parents were from," then you're taking a little breath, right? Because you don't know what they're going to say based on their own experience. But absolutely, in every case, the people have said, "We love it. We love our system. We think it's great. So glad you're talking about it here," something like that. This is genuinely, genuinely very, very popular in Australia, and that's a very helpful thing for us to have.
And by like 2023 was, I only joined Fair Vote Washington last fall. So that was before I was involved. But I've heard a little bit about that process. Charlotte Mena, by the way, someone put in the chat, was the sponsor. She is an incredible champion this year for our RCV local options bill. But yeah, thank you for flying out to Washington then.
All right.
Hopefully we can get something going in the future again.
All right, great. Yes, Charlotte she actually came. We did a panel discussion for the Funders Committee on Civic Participation, and she was one of the speakers at it on universal voting. I think she's great.
Right. As we're talking about coalitions and connections, Ken in Arizona notes that there was a constitutional initiative on the ballot for kind of a combination of reforms. That one was open primaries and ranked choice voting. So, has 100% democracy ever discussed vote by phone? Is Ken's question. And also, I'm recalling you mentioned that there were 6 national organizations, I think you said, that endorse universal voting. So, can you talk about your coalitions and endorsers a bit?
Sure. Yeah, I'll take that first. Or Raaheela, why don't you? You know the 6 organizations.
Oh, we have 6 of them. State Voices, Working Families Party, Public Citizen, Black Voters Matter, Community Change, and
And the NAACP itself.
the NAACP itself. There's, when I go through this list, it's like you always forget one. It's always the one. But I think with each of them, there's been kind of a different way that folks have gotten involved and engaged. I think what was interesting for me as we were going through this process is the NAACP has had this on their kind of list of things, kind of their agenda for a long time. And they actually reaffirmed it in 2019 as a part of a longer resolution that they had. And so that's kind of the larger coalition of organizations that are believing in this concept of universal voting and 100% voting participation. To the other point, the other question that was in about vote by phone, I think, I don't know, Miles, if you want to address this, but from our perspective, it's very much like universal voting is not a silver bullet, right? There's going to be a lot of other types of needs from communities and other reforms that are really integral to making sure that our democracy works. And that's up to localities to be able to decide what is needed in that moment for a particular group or a particular state of people. And so we also, through the gateway reforms, have listed a bunch of different types of reforms that would make universal voting a system that can be implemented with fidelity. And so, just noting that we are supportive of a lot of different voter access types of reforms to making sure that universal voting is possible. Miles, is there anything you wanted to add?
No, I mean, in a general way, we are supportive of any ways in which it is more accessible and more easy to vote. There are issues that people have raised around internet voting and Is it something that is really safe, et cetera? And that's sort of that's not right in our wheelhouse. I mean, but my instinct is to be supportive of all of those things. And I'm sure if there were voting by phone, mechanisms of identifying the caller and verifying that the person was who they say they were, um, would be part of the process. So generally speaking, yes.
We have a practical question here from Steve in California. Does universal voting, would that require universal registration, or could people opt out from registering in the first place?
That's a very good question. And the situation in Australia is interesting in this regard, which is um, they call it enrollment, not registration, but they do all kinds of things. They have a very strong central election commission. They do all kinds of things, mobile vans to go out and register people. And they have actually 96% of all citizens in Australia are enrolled, are registered. The mandatory requirement applies to people who are registered. So theoretically, yes, if you really, really, really didn't want to vote and therefore you didn't register, that's okay. And the truth is, out in the book and in the recommendations that we have, if you want to opt out, if you have a conscientious objection, which doesn't need to be a religious exemption, we would be in favor of that. The point is not to force people against their will. The point is to turn the culture on its head to say, we believe that everyone should be participating, and you can opt out if you really want to, but the cultural norm should be for everybody to participate, as opposed to the cultural norm being, come if you feel like it.
It is interesting that it would be definitely a cultural shift, right? A whole different perception of the role of voting in society. Have there been any places that have converted to universal voting recently that would show how that cultural shift brings it to that point and what happens afterwards?
Interesting. The example I like to give the is Chile, which actually had it for a very long time, and then at one point when a conservative government was in, I think maybe somewhere around 20 years ago, they eliminated it, and the new Chilean Constitutional Convention has reestablished universal voting in Chile, and it was in use in their last national election. Oh, by the way, here's another really interesting point, which is Uruguay, small country, but they have had it for a very long time. They just had an election in Uruguay where 91% of the people participated, and the leftist opposition leader was elected. And in a smooth transfer of power took place, and it was kind of it's sort of one of the ideal Latin American democracies. So Uruguay is another good case in point. Oh, by the way, here's an incentive system for you. In Peru, if you vote, if you're a young voter and you vote, you get extra points on your college application over the people who are applying for college and didn't vote. So there are all kinds of creative ways that you could think of to make this work.
That's a pretty excellent top student prize, I think. Top voter gets,
Right.
yeah. Um, Here's a question I gotta ask you because as a ranked choice voting advocate, I'm sure this is familiar to us. Does universal voting benefit one party over another?
Very good question. Raaheela, why don't you take that one?
Yeah, there's nothing to say that that would be the case. What we have seen and what we believe is that it'll probably just bring out more people of, we're not talking about universal voting as switching a state from red to blue or blue to red necessarily. It's just more of whoever is there is likely to come out. And so if we look at it from that perspective, it's like, what is the incentive for folks to want to get more of the same people out? And I think it's what we're talking about is this is beyond elections as election to election. This is about a long-term goal and strategy to make sure that we have a culture where we retain democracy, right? And so yeah, to answer the question, there's nothing that we have seen to say, okay, this will actually flip or switch elections on a large scale from red to blue or blue to red.
It is, by the way, though, it's Celia, it is a very interesting question because we do get it all the time, which is from Republicans, they say, well, isn't this just a kind of a a shadow campaign to help Democrats? And from from my Democratic friends, we get, well, listen, so many people came out in 2024 and ended up voting for Donald Trump. Is that something we really want to do? And my answer is that we are doing this because we think it's good for democracy, not to advantage one party or the other. We think that if people who are now um, low propensity voters who have been outside the system for one way or another come into it and are invited into it and get the information, et cetera, that's a good thing. In some places, it will definitely bring out more conservative voters. In other places, it'll certainly bring out more progressive voters. Again, for us, that is really not the issue. And I think you can you it we are obviously getting more support from Democratic elected officials and activists than we are from conservatives, but we are insisting that we're doing this in a nonpartisan way.
There was an interesting point I recall in your book that lit up my brain a little bit that said, if there were an area with perhaps voters of a, certain party were a strong majority that moved to universal voting, and then therefore more of those voters are turning up in general, perhaps there could be areas that have a majority of a different party of voters who would also want to have that. It's almost like a war of escalation, but it leads to more democratic participation, which I thought was very interesting. Because sometimes we have these incentives that don't lead to greater democracy, but there's a scenario that could.
Right. One article that was in the Atlantic maybe 5 or 6 years ago that Nick Stephanopoulos wrote made the case that how this could really happen is that blue cities in red states could adopt it. So think about Memphis, Tennessee. And if all of a sudden 90% of the people in Memphis are voting in a gubernatorial election, that's going to have a huge impact. And that would also then, kind of what you call it, influence other places in the state to say, well, we want to have as much influence as those people in Memphis are having. And so you might get it adopted in other places or even statewide. Now, not to be Pollyanna here, you could also imagine a situation where Memphis adopted and the state legislature moved to, override it in some way. So all these issues are really tough ones. But in our view, this is a very early effort to inject this into the political conversation. And so when we get to the point where Memphis adopts it, and then we have to fight with the Republican legislature in Tennessee, we will have made great progress by then.
Great. We are coming to the end of our time, and there are still more questions. So maybe we can pose those after the fact. We will be sending out a follow-up email with all the contact information and the recording. And we can certainly take questions after the fact and direct them to Miles and Raaheela. There is a question about whether you'll be at the American Democracy Summit. And to me, this leads into what's the best way for people to connect and network with you?
Well, I guess I would just say, we're not sure. We have been thinking about whether we should, kind of propose a session at the American Democracy Summit. We haven't quite decided because it's a lot of travel and all that stuff. But yes, but I would say just go to the website, sign up. Our email information is there. Start a conversation, and we'll figure out what's the best next step forward. And as I said, we would be delighted to go anywhere virtually, so to speak, and talk about this issue with any of you. Again, let me end by saying I'm a real admirer of the work that all of you have done. So I consider us all to be part of what I think is a growing and robust democracy movement. the arc bends slowly and sometimes it twists around. But I think we have to keep moving, try to really hard to keep moving forward and stay optimistic.
Well, thank you so much for working towards your vision, towards a better democracy for all of us. This has been a wonderful discussion with Miles Rapoport and Raaheela Ahmed of 100% Democracy. Thank you all for being here, and I look forward to our future work.
Okay, thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thank you.